I've always seen stakeholder engagement as really important during a crisis, but it's also about building those stakeholder relationships before you have a crisis. So, if you're trying on the fly when the crisis hits you to then build those stakeholder relationships, it's really, really hard because everyone's focused on responding to the crisis. So it's all about, for me, building those relationships with other heads of communication, and with other stakeholders in the area that you're working in. So often in my past, I've worked in big cities. So it's having those relationships with your university, with your faith groups, community groups, with transport providers, with all the other people you might have to work with in a crisis, but building those relationships in the good times, having opportunities to understand everyone else's business and drivers, so that when a crisis hits, you know what each other can deliver, and you also have that, you've built that trust in each other, so you don't have to do the dancing around about the relationship that's already in place, so that you can actually focus on delivery of the task. And it's easier to ask a partner organization in a crisis, could you deliver that, if you already have that sort of relationship. So for me, it's kind of fundamental. And in terms of stakeholders, that could also include your relationships with the media. We all know that in a major crisis, you'll have sort of national media parachuting in and potentially international. But your relationships with your local media, again, really come into play if you've got those relationships with local editors and reporters, and you've worked together over the years. And yes, sometimes that relationship gets a bit pushed, but fundamentally, if it's built on respect and trust, you can then at least work with your local media, sharing what information you can, and you're helping build those relationships in terms of interviews. If you've got to have principal senior leaders going out doing interviews, at least some of them will be with reporters that they know and that there is that basis of trust with.
So you've mentioned trust, which is an interesting kind of one. How important is that trust? And I suppose, are there ways that we can build it for those difficult times?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The trust seems to me to be the sort of fundamental glue in terms of relationships with communities and stakeholders. If you haven't built up that rapport and trust, it's very difficult to get people to move at pace, because you get a lot of questions. Whereas if you already have the trust relationship and you ask for something, people say, okay, they're only asking because they do need that. So you don't get that coming backwards and forwards when you need to do things quickly. And I think with communities, that point about building trust over time is really important, because if you've done lots of community engagement work with local communities, if a crisis happens in their community, people are much more likely to listen, if you're the local authority, to what you're asking them to do. If you're asking them to evacuate out of a space or not share misinformation online, if you already have that relationship of trust, people are much more likely to do that. Whereas if they don't feel that the local authority is transparent and honest with them, they're much less likely to do what you're asking them to do. And in fact, they're more likely to do things you don't want them to do in a crisis. So start sharing information which is inappropriate, start speculating on the causes of things which might not be helpful. And I think that relationship with community is really important in terms of also what the community can deliver in a crisis. It may be the community that's setting up a rest area or providing just tea and reassurance to people who've suffered from the crisis. And it also gives that something for councillors to be involved with. Often elected members you know, when a crisis hits, the leader has a clear role. Maybe the cabinet members have a clear role, but then the rest of the members are less clear what they can be doing. Whereas if they have those relationships into their communities, they're much more able to get involved with helping deliver on the ground with the community response. I think we're the people who are best placed to build those stakeholder relationships. So sometimes we're supporting our senior leadership team to have round tables or regular meetings with other chief executives or senior leaders. So often we're creating the space for that, setting the agenda, helping put together the policy narratives that those leaders work on. But also we're building the relationships across the organisations with other heads of communications, but also through our local resilience forums, with those other parties that we would need to work together with. And whereas other professionals are only engaging on their particular professional piece of work, so lawyers might be talking to lawyers, we're talking to the whole organisation and sharing information, doing collaborative events. So I think building those stakeholder relationships, creating stakeholder databases, all that to me sits really positively with communications. But I know it is yet another thing we ask our communicators to do on top of all the other roles they're doing. So I think it's, first off, spend the time building the people relationships long before you might ever do even any crisis scenario planning. And this is about making time, and it's really hard in a long, busy schedule to make time for the personal relationships, the cup of tea, the catch-up call, the offer of support to another organisation when they're having perhaps difficulties, all those things which are extra to our day-to-day role, but they're what create that bank of social capital and that feeling of mutual respect and support. It's creating the spaces for people to meet up. So sometimes we're the people who initiate things, you know, whether it's a lunchtime get together, or as I say, maybe it's supporting chief executives with their sort of city leaders initiatives. So it's all those points of engagement with communities. I think that communications professionals should be involved in building community engagement, whether that's through planning or whether it's through other activities. We should be there supporting. We should be there at Pride events. We should be there at key events for the community, whether it's, you know, Diwali or Eid, and supporting communities and being visible. And that's for heads of communications and chief executives. I think those two roles particularly are the ones that need to be out there making those relationships. And it is a big call because it means being out there at weekends and evenings, not just the 9 to 5. For me, it's about making time for people, the people part of what we do. We can be very functional and task-based, and we can be thinking about, you know, the next campaign or the next big initiative we're going to do. But fundamentally, the whole way our organisations work and our relationships with other organisations and stakeholders is all based on people relationships. And those take time to build. And you, in my experience, you feel it. If you've built those relationships over time, when something isn't going so well, you know that you have a bank of people who will personally support you and give you personal resilience, which is always important. And also will be there to counter any negative narratives on media or social media, because they'll stand up for you. They'll say, no, actually, these are good guys. They do the work. So I think it is a kind of investment of time that is really worthwhile.